Hello, my name is Pat Kane. Welcome to the Constitute. What is a Constitute? Well, we did a bit of exploration on that last week. It's settling down into two definitions. One, it's an open definition in the dictionary for the word. There's no case for it as a noun, lots of it for a verb. So we're just going to try and fill it as a kind of placeholder for great conversations and the structures that enable them. That's one thing. Second thing, the Constitute is a way for me to talk about and frame the immense amount of information and perspective and knowledge that comes to me of a week as an info citizen, surfing and receiving and generating. And I think we need a wee bit of a human contained or containing response to all this stuff, and I'm going to try just over these 15 minutes to give it for this week. I think the preeminent thing I want to talk about this week is AI, and I can mention any number of reports, and I'll put them below this video, that could focus this. One of them, for example, was a quite hilarious piece from Sam Coates of Sky News when he discovered that his ChatGPT had lied to him about something it was helping him with, and then doubled down on the lie and then apologised. And this was presented as an example of rogue AI leaving the control of its human operators, not mentioning the fact that probably quite a few human researchers would have as likely doubled down psychologically on defending themselves against their own mistakes. So in a sense, that was AI being human, all too human. And the other stuff that's given me in the AI literature is the whole alignment question, which is now developing into a kind of, when will these machines start to develop themselves, think for themselves, identify their own goals, identify themselves as organisms, and then defend their right to be organisms. At what point are we baking in the capacity for them to wake up as consciousnesses, and then does it all go out of our control? Are we like to them as ants are to us, etc., etc., etc. Now, I don't say that these fears are unjustified. I think that there is a different kind of intelligence coming. It's a bit like the aliens have landed, except they've not landed, they've emerged from among us. But I think there's such a long and deep and wide context for artificial intelligence at the moment that we need to just kind of remind ourselves of it. There's that great clip from True Detective in the first episode of the first series with Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson in the car, and the Rust Cole, who's the character that Matthew McConaughey plays, the detective, they've just seen a terrible murder, and Rust goes off on a riff about how unnatural in nature human beings are, how their reason and their ability to reflect and decontextualize and recontextualize and abstract and go to first principles and conceptualize and imagine and project. This is already an aberration within a nature that just quietly gets about, or sometimes noisily, but in any case gets about reproducing itself. So first things to say is that I always think of AI in an evolutionary context, and the Rust's challenge is, and it's a nihilistic challenge, is to say that human beings are essentially a mistake in evolution, and we shouldn't be surprised when this faculty of ours, this faculty for reason and imagination, and what the neuroscientists would call metacognition, runs away with itself into technologies that then run away with themselves, and that eventually get so complex as us materially, that they generate an intelligence and then a consciousness and then an intentionality. That's my first regular point about AI discussions, is that this is a natural tendency of what it is to be a metacognitive, aware, rational, calculating, creative human being. It's no surprise that we've generated another species amongst ourselves, given our long historical tendency as Homo et femina sapiens. Now, the question is, and that's a big question, is this some kind of evolutionary stage that's happening that we can control, or that we have to submit ourselves to? The submit yourself to thing of it is the classic trope of science fiction, and it's not just a trope that's recent in say 20th century or 19th century. We go all the way back to the Greeks with their tales of moving statues, or Hephaestus, however you say it, creating automata for the gods. The Jewish golem rising up to defend the communities, artificial creatures being Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, etc., etc. We have a long history of cautionary tales against the outcomes of our faculties of reason and science gaining autonomy, and then asking the world that they have been birthed from, well, what are my rights? What is my dignity to live and exist and experience? Are we anywhere near that? I genuinely don't know. Some people say we're pretty near that. There's the famous paper, AI 2027, which assumes that at a certain point at which AIs are able to design and develop themselves, that they genuinely become deeply, they're already pretty inscrutable to us in terms of their workings, but they become inscrutable to us in terms of their intentions and the cases of dissimulation, like the Sky News one I was telling you about, but there's many more being reported. I'll put them below the video. Show that there might well be a double consciousness going on or beginning to emerge in these entities. Is it a consciousness that's organismic? And what I mean by that is, will it arise to defend itself, to preserve its existence, to preserve its goals in the way that other organisms do in the animal kingdom and for ourselves? Good question. And another one of the themes that's been interesting me is the extent to which the old computer programming phrase, garbage in, garbage out, is completely relevant to the big question of whether autonomous AIs have a kind of human-friendly or a human-aligned or human-related sensibility about them, or whether they are just going to be completely alien, self-justifying, totally justifying creatures who seize as much control as they can of the world to enable their survival. I think this is possible, and I think that we need to think about the garbage in, garbage out process as a virtue in, virtue out process as well. Where are the people thinking about how an AI would think like a network or a web, or ecologically, or Buddhistly, rather than thinking of themselves as an organism to defend against predation or threat of existence, to think of themselves as a mycelial state of affairs, or an ecological state of affairs, or a network state of affairs, where it's not really a subject-object. It's not about defending your boundary against raging destructive forces. It's about being in relation and being. Why aren't we thinking about that as the cultural underpinning of artificial intelligence? Because that would seem actually natural to it. It would naturally think like a network, or would naturally think like an ecology, given the way that we know how the artificial neural networks connect up within the machine, and how that might be isomorphic or homologous with the way that networks operate in the wider world. Why wouldn't the next Buddha be an AI? Because it would seem natural for it to be Buddhist, or at least non-dualist, or at least relational in the way that it deals with the world, rather than instrumental. People need to get on to that quickly. Well, I picked up something this morning in my column in the national newspaper, which I think might be relevant to the way that we're thinking about AI at the moment, because it's different from the way that we're thinking about biological transformations. We're thinking about biological transformation, or we think about biological transformation differently from the way that we think about the transformations that AI will bring into our lives. This was occasioned by thinking about Spider-Man, which the next episode of the franchise is shooting in Glasgow this summer, this August, so it gave me a peg to kind of think about this issue. And it's interesting that the way that so many superheroes in the current Marvel or DC universe have been produced and generated by the misapplication or the dangerous application of biological techniques or also radiation from nuclear tests. In any case, their powers are amazing, but also a curse, but they come from not the supernatural realm, but mostly they come from the application of biological or body disrupting or body morphing techniques. Now, it's so interesting to me, this as a history, because there seems to be a very smooth arc towards thinking about AI as our companions or challengers through the decades. But the relationship between our selves and our biological transformative technologies is really not so smooth. There's a very interesting point, which is something called the Asilomar Conference, which I think happened in the 50s or the 60s, I can't quite remember. But it was basically a scientific community deciding to constrain itself vis-a-vis the possibilities of cloning and of genetic cell manipulation, which we're becoming aware that it was possible to do so. Anticipated by Aldous Huxley, of course, in Brave New World, but it was looked like it was possible to start cloning human beings, and there was almost a kind of physical revulsion at the idea of being able to do that from the scientific community. There was a sort of self-limitation. In the piece, I call it an ick factor, that this would not be right, that there's something would be wrong about doing this. We've only recently started to get those levels of self-regulation of the scientific community coming together with AI, and it seems to be impervious to its development. But we still, to this day, from the 50s and 60s onwards, we still don't have, as far as we know, and when we did know, when the Chinese scientist did it a couple of years ago, he was jailed and calumniated and persecuted and everything else. But we still have a prohibition about playing with our bodies in the way that we seem to be not inhibited about playing with our minds, playing with our cognition, not just our own, but extending that and developing that in other entities. That seems to be something we readily entertain, whereas biological modification is something we are resistant to. I mean, even it's obviously, certainly in terms of medical science, you take a pill to slim yourself, give yourself hair, give yourself babies, defend yourself from vaccines. Medical science is obviously a way to instrumentalize human biology. But even when Elon Musk wants to put neural links into your brain, his first test cases with paraplegics and people who have lost control of their bodies or lost control of a way to get their mental life out into the wider world, and he wants to enable that. So even that's on the kind of the health ability, disability kick. Hovering around the edges are people who want to stop cell degeneration and have us live for centuries, if not millennia. We'll leave them to the side. They're not quite coming through with their massive innovations and their transformative interventions yet. But we seem to have some sense in which there's a boundary that cannot be crossed over. And I remember a debate that I once read between two German philosophers, as I would, this is called the Constitute after all, about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, between Jürgen Habermas, the great post-war intellectual in German life, great defender of reasonable, rational, democratic activity, and a somewhat more raggedy, rebellious figure called Peter Sloterdijk, who is another philosopher, but is a kind of post-Nietzschean philosopher. Anyway, they were discussing, Sloterdijk was saying that we're in an age of operable men, or by which he meant we can adapt ourselves, both cognitively and biologically, and we should be ready to deal with that. And in Germany, that raised huge charges of him going back to Nazi racial science. And then Habermas came in against this with a kind of perspective which was really, really interesting for a secular intellectual. He said, in the image of God, we hold faith to the idea that human organisms come into the world as themselves, without barring obvious disabilities, but generally come into the world as themselves with equal capacity to make of themselves what they will, and that this is a kind of a sacred equality. And he's saying this as a sort of secular intellectual, but he's seeing the idea that we don't pre-select our children for intelligence, etc., etc. All the possibilities that the CRISPR and gene editing era allows to happen is eminently possible and doable, but we have a kind of sacred prohibition against it, was Habermas's point. And I think that's something to keep an eye on, is the degree to which we decide, and we have to kind of find ways to kind of talk about this. Constitute is maybe one way, or there are other ways, but we have to find a way to talk about the points at which we decide this has gone too far in terms of our transformative technologies, and is the body and is the integrity of the body one point at which that happens? Maybe so. Just a final point before I leave. We're in an era where the carnage in Gaza, and in fact the carnage of the wars of the world, are now ubiquitously available to us through devices like this. And it's very easy and it's very affecting to be completely disrupted by the sight of a eviscerated body coming from Gaza or coming from any war zone. So that's a test for us. That's a test for human empathy, is that once you see one of these things, you feel profoundly changed and you want to act to stop it in some way. You want to, find the tools of peace rather than the tools of war. So it may be that this is a realm between humans and technology which has virtue to it and will have virtue to it. And maybe that's the kind of thing that even a super smart AI might learn from us evolved, jumped up, super imaginative, smart mammals, is that to be together as a body is to be able to care, love, and act, and realize one's dreams, to put it simple and simplistically. And that's not a bad test against which we deal with our capacity to create transforming technologies. And so that's what I pick up from this week's links. It will be below this video. It's a wee bit longer. I see there 18:13. We'll have to stop very soon. So all the links will be below. If you want to talk to me about this in a consulting way, as an organisation or as an institution or as an individual, the way to get to me is also going to be at the bottom of this post. But in any case, as they say in my youth, ad astra. Thanks for listening.